Desi is on that. Desi's on that, and I'm on that, and a couple of other folks as well. And that task force is tasked with looking at the institutional master plan, or the IMP, that Boston Medical Center has proposed. So one of the aspects of that master plan has to do with a new housing initiative. And so this meeting is really focused on that aspect of the institutional master plan. And then, just so everyone is aware, the master plan then goes for approval to the BPDA ultimately at the end of the day. And this is kind of like the institutional equivalent of an Article 80 process in terms of development. So I just wanted to sort of frame it so that folks knew how this sort of came about. Fair?
Okay. Okay. And there's several members of the I, including you and Desi and Fernando and maybe others here today.
Yep.
And there's members of Blackstone Franklin also. Okay. So basically there's two older buildings on Harrison Ave, and BMC, as part of the IMP, is proposing to turn them into housing in a fairly complicated way that they will explain to us. So I'm going to let Megan and Bob take the time they need. They will not answer questions until the very end. Okay? Thanks. Go, take it away.
Great. Thank you. Christy, can you share the slide deck? Great. Thanks. So I'm Bob Biggio. I'm the Senior Vice President of Facilities and Support Services for Boston Medical Center. I'm going to kind of quickly bring you through just some slides to give you an overview of the overall institutional master plan that we've proposed, and then turn it over to Megan Sandell so she can get into more details about our housing proposal. Gonna start. Okay. So this first slide is just gives you an overview of the team from BMC that's been working on our institutional master plan. It includes both internal folks within BMC, but also our list of consultants that have been actively helping us with the proposal. So as I said, we'll go through the 10-year overview of our overall IMP proposal. I'll talk a little bit about the two older buildings that George mentioned that we're going to propose for this mixed use residential concept. A very brief touch on transportation. And then we'll talk primarily about the housing proposal itself and why it's important to our patients. Next slide. So really the goals of our institutional master plan is to really look at redesigning our facilities layout to better align with some of the changes that are taking place within the healthcare setting, which really begins to integrate into team-based care the behavioral health needs and social needs of our patients with their medical treatment. And so we have more caregivers that are functioning within one clinical space, if you will, to provide team-based care to our patients. We also need to accommodate the increase in patient volume that we've been seeing. Certainly during COVID, we had a significant increase in inpatients, but we're seeing that growth in inpatient volume is not subsiding, and so we have to accommodate that. Additionally, the codes for healthcare facilities continue to evolve, and in most cases, it's requiring that spaces become larger as we introduce new technologies into the care setting. And so we need to right size much of our clinical spaces to meet these new standards and codes that we're required to adhere to. And then, specifically on the housing front, we need to leverage the highest and best use of our building resources. And those particular facilities that we're going to talk about really aren't, while they were inpatient buildings back at the turn of the century when they were originally built, they're really not suitable for patient care any longer. And so we believe this is a good adaptive reuse proposal for those buildings. Next slide. So essentially we're in the IMP, we're looking at gaining Article 80D site review for site use and massing and height. but we're not seeking the detailed Article 80B process. We would go through that process for larger projects that are being proposed if and when we move into construction or propose to move into construction with those projects. The projects being proposed in this IMP is a small 15,500 square foot wraparound addition on top of the Yawkey building that expands the 6th floor of our Yawkey building to make it a little larger. We're also proposing a modest bump out on the front of the Menino building to improve our lobby. And then potentially add an additional floor on top of the Menino building, 37,000 square feet for additional inpatient beds. And then on the 10 Stoughton Street parcel, which is where the Vose building is, which really can't be seen from the street, but it's kind of behind BU's Robinson building off of Albany Street. I'm sorry, off of Harrison Avenue. We're proposing to build a new research facility. And then finally, the Collamore and Old Evans renovation right next to 10 Stoughton Street is where we're proposing to do the housing. We're also going to continue to carry over the projects that were previously approved in our last IMP, but we haven't moved forward with those projects yet, so we'll carry those forward until we do move those into construction. The Yawkey 6 wraparound edition that I mentioned is really the only proposed project that we see as an immediate project that we're looking for design review only. It is below both the large and small project review thresholds because the size of the square footage is so small. So it's really, I guess I can't really say enough about how COVID has changed the way we've had to think about this IMP. We took a significant pause for really over a year, not only to deal with COVID, but we really caused us to take a step back and rethink the way we were proposing the IMP. One of the reasons is the introduction of telehealth. Significant, depending on the clinic type, many of our clinics, the telehealth has reduced some of the volumes that we believe we're going to see in the future. Probably the best example of that would be in our psychiatry department, where I want to say prior to COVID, we had about a 20% no-show rate in our psychiatry, but now that's gone to essentially zero, which is a great thing because, you know, we have more of our patients getting the care that they need, but it also means that we're going to need less square footage potentially to see those patients. As I mentioned earlier, the surge of inpatients that we saw during the COVID surge really isn't subsiding. Although we're not seeing COVID patients, our inpatient volume is still very high at over 90% occupancy rates. And so we desperately need to add some beds. The other thing that really came to the forefront is that as part of the vaccine development, it was highlighted that a lot of BMC's patients are underrepresented in clinical trials across the country. And so there's a renewed interest with many organizations to partner with BMC on these clinical trials and on research trials. And so, that's why we've introduced the 10 Stoughton Street as a research facility is in the project. And then, for our patients, I think many people saw that, while we were all being asked to stay at home, a lot of BMC's patients didn't have a home to stay at. And so, we worked with the state to reopen Newton Pavilion and tried to provide some shelter during the height of the surge. And then finally, the introduction of Zoom into our workplace has really caused us to look long-term at more work from home for some of our back office functions. And so we see our administrative needs for certain functions being less going forward than they have been historically. And so that's also reflected in the plan. Next slide. So because of each of those things that we've experienced during the COVID, building H, which was the building that was proposed to be on the next to the Newton Pavilion where the loading docks are. We've decided to remove that from the plan because a significant part of it was going to be outpatient, and we don't think we're going to need that space in the short term or long term at this point. And I think that makes many in the community happy. I know that was a lightning rod during the first proposal. And then the Site E, which is the 10 Stoughton Street Research Building, we've actually proposed to add another couple of floors to that to compensate for some of the square footage we lost on Building H by not doing that. But also to adapt that project more for the increase in research that we think we're going to see due to the COVID. Next slide. And actually, before you go to the next slide, the projects A, B, and C. So A is the wraparound addition that I mentioned on the Yawkey building. It just increases the size of that floor plate. B is the small bump out of the Menino lobby to make the lobby a little larger. And then C would be the additional floor on top of the Menino building. So again, on the inpatient, we need to continue to right size our inpatient rooms, and DPH now requires all single bed rooms. And so we still have a significant number of semi-private or 2-bed rooms that we need to, as we move forward, begin to convert to single bed rooms. And our current occupancy rates are over 90%. And so, these projects provide a path to add beds to our campus. As I mentioned, we're going to look to right size the outpatient space. We're also, over time, we're continuing to shift into the Crosstown building that we acquired a couple of years ago now to move some of our outpatient, particularly out of the Preston. Over time, we see those clinics beginning to shift to the Crosstown building. Research, as I mentioned, the 170, Stoughton Street. We're looking to expand that largely for the research within our patient population as the growth needs expand there. And then finally, the mixed use residential housing for health program. We're looking at essentially establishing supportive pathways for our patients within housing so that we can both provide wraparound supportive services and healthcare services for those that are medically complex and that are housing unstable. Next slide. So this slide here, at the top of the page, where you see Collamore and the Old Evans building, those are frontage along East Newton Street. Those are the two buildings that we're proposing to use for housing. It's about 120,000 square feet, give or take. And as I mentioned, they're quite old, and right now they have some office space in them, but we're going to be vacating the office space, and they're not really suitable for medical use. And we believe housing would be an appropriate use for those. And then the 10 Stoughton Street, the blue outline, and this in the center of the page, is essentially where we're proposing to put the research building, which is largely hidden from the view from the street. But we think the adjacency to both the BU campus as well as the housing is a good location for the type of research that we would be doing there. So, transportation, essentially these projects add a total of 411,000 square feet of new space. And then the conversion of the Collamore and Old Evans for administration use is 130 residential units. When we look at the transportation impacts, the studies suggest that the impacts will be negligible. Overall length of service when you compare it to not building these projects as opposed to building the fully built conditions with all of these projects built. We currently control about 3,800 spaces in 5 garages and 4 surface lots across the campus, many of them jointly with Boston University. Approximately 3,500 of the spaces are owned and 500 are leased. And we're really not proposing to add any new parking because we see that the parking impacts really being negligible from the addition of this space. We're proposing under the 10 Stoughton Street building to add 72 spaces, but we're also planning to vacate the DOB building, our doctor's office building, and vacate the use of most of that garage. There's 238 spaces in there. When we vacate, we'll only be keeping about 60 of those as the leased spaces. So there's no new parking. So now to get into the more detail of the housing for health. The next slide. So what is the mixed use residential proposals? Essentially, it's the adaptive reuse of the Collamore and Old Evans building that I mentioned before. It's really the upper levels of the building, the first 2 floors, which don't align with street level. So the ground level, if you will, is about half a floor below grade. And those 2 floors we expect to use largely for, office or commercial, or potentially some retail if we can get it in there. The floor alignment makes it a bit of a challenge, but we're hoping we can figure out how to get some retail in there as well. And so it's floors 3 through 7 that we would be proposing to use for both market rate and affordable housing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the 10 Stoughton Street parcel behind it, we would do some below grade parking that would be shared with both the office space as well as the housing units. We would be building approximately 130 spaces. About 100 of them would be market rate and about 30 would be affordable. And then the BMC patients, the supportive housing would essentially be contained within those 30 affordable. I expect that most of them would be for supportive uses. I would stress that the market rate's extremely important to have them as part of the project in order to make the project financially viable for BMC. We're not a residential developer. We're doing this largely because we believe it will be beneficial for our patients for these 30. But we don't expect to be long-term kind of holders of all of the real estate there. And so, having the market rate to make the project financially viable is extremely important to us. So we'd be partnering with a private developer. There'd be 3 steps for the approval. Right now, we're going through the BMC IMP approval. And it is accurate that getting the IMP approval would allow BMC to move forward with it, but we really couldn't move forward with it because the zoning wouldn't apply to the private developer. It would only be if BMC owned it, which we're going to be a minority owner. And so we would have to go through the ZBA to get a zoning approval so that the project could be financed by a developer, and that if BMC eventually decided to exit ownership interest, the zoning would stay in place. Otherwise, the value of the real estate would essentially go away without BMC being an owner. Because the zoning can't carry over to anyone else. And so we would have to have that zoning relief in order to move the project forward. And when the project moved forward, we would then go through that Article 80 large project review in more detail. So we're really talking about it at a very high level at this time. I expect, as I said, there's office space in there now. We will probably vacate it over the course of the next 18 to 24 months. So anticipated timeline would be 2 to 5 years to move the project forward. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Megan Sandell so she can give you a little bit more flavor as to why this is important for our patients.
Great. Thank you, Bob, so much. During the IMP meeting, I kind of heard 2 things loud and clear. We needed to talk about what this Housing for Health program was and what it isn't, and then why would BMC want to do this? And so I'm going to hope the next couple of slides gives a little bit more specificity, and then I'd be happy to answer more questions. So what is kind of the supportive housing, the Housing for Health program that we're talking about? I want to emphasize this is affordable housing really designed for people with complex medical needs, things like heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes, other serious health conditions. And we would combine the access to the affordable housing with social and financial supportive services. We view this as a highly effective strategy to help people with chronic conditions and housing instability be able to receive the appropriate care. So by being proximate to the hospital, we would design it for people that need that proximity for their complex medical conditions. We have been doing some of these case studies already, working with Boston Housing Authority as our kind of affordable housing partner, and demonstrating that when we have people close to these types of healthcare services with their coordinated care management, we're able to actually reduce the number of costly medical services and be able to improve patient health outcomes. I'm going to emphasize 4 really important points because I've heard some concerns about them. Number 1, this is not a treatment center. Number 2, this is not a homeless shelter. Number 3, this is not a sober home. Number 4, this is not transitional housing. This is really meant to be affordable housing with embedded supportive services to set people up for success. Next slide. As we think about this, you may say, well, why is a hospital interested in housing? And one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is the Affordable Care Act actually had within it certain things that motivated health systems to do, honestly, what you sometimes refer to as higher value services and being less oriented towards volume. And so one of that is that we have created things called accountable care organizations. You sometimes will hear about them in the news as ACOs. And what that does is it incentivizes Boston Medical Center to develop models of care that actually reduce patients' use of costly healthcare services, where they keep coming in over and over again for preventable chronic conditions. And so what we know is actually that many of our patients' medical use or medical complexity is actually more related to their social determinants of health, things like lack of employment, food, and stable housing. And so it's meant that our health system has really tried to invest more in what are ways in which we can improve access to safe and affordable housing options, really across a portfolio of different approaches, this being just one of them. And we have been, over the last couple of years, piloting these supportive housing models and shown with, the early stages of 20 to 30 people being housed in both Boston Housing Authority units, and then more recently with vouchers called the Section 811 voucher program, that we can successfully stabilize people and have them be successful in housing. And I think that what the COVID-19 pandemic has showed us more and more is that these inequities in our community really has just exacerbated housing stability. And so we need to really lean into creating more access for our patients. If you go to the next slide, I just want to be able to share 2 of those patient stories. So one was Carl, who was housed through our complex care management program in partnership with the Elders Living at Home program. Carl had previously really poorly controlled congestive heart failure. And so when he was cycling in and out of housing unstable programs, he wasn't able to control his diet. He would end up coming back in over and over again. And what we ended up showing was that once he was housed, he was able to be successful. And so he talks about, I can come and go when I want. I don't have to worry about being in a certain time. It means I can cook my own meals. I have freedom. Another example is Yvonne, who was housed. She has 3 children. She was, when she and her husband were no longer together, she wasn't able to afford her apartment. She was at risk of being evicted. We were able to stabilize her in an affordable housing apartment. She was able to finish her RN degree. This is her graduating, and she's gone on to be really done incredibly well. And so she said, my kids, I have to be strong for them. I have to get to a point whereby I'm able to stand on my own 2 feet. And by being able to be in an affordable housing apartment, she was able to get there. And so we have permission to share these stories just because we wanted to put a bit of a face on who we're talking about and who we're trying to serve. And so with that, I think that's my last slide. And I would love to be able to open it up for more questions. Thank you very much.
George, are you there? Desi? George?
George is on mute. I don't know if he realizes he's on.
So
mute.
Now I'm off. No, yeah, I lost mine. I lost
okay.
mine. I'm
George,
back.
it's all you.
I'm back. I'd like, I can't see who has questions. Oh, but why don't we start with Fernando, because Fernando had strong opinions last time. Do you want to go, Fernando?
There are two hands raised, George. I'm
Okay.
happy to tell
Oh
you.
yeah.
who's
Oh, you know what?
speaking.
I have problems with this. For some reason, they don't show up. So why don't you call on people then, Megan? That'd be
Okay.
great.
All right, thanks, George. Yvette was the first person I saw, and then Andy was the second person I saw.
Hi, thank you, Megan, and thanks to all of you for your presentations. My question is, could you please put the addition of 30 housing units into a context or a perspective that I can relate to relative to Boston Medical? I mean, I look at Boston Medical and it's like, God, you've got thousands of patients, and it's like, how does 30 units of housing achieve what BMC wants to do?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm happy to take a first stab, and then Bob, if you would like to add anything. So I want to emphasize, in many ways, this is for us a portfolio approach. So in that, we were really excited to hear about DCAM's announcement, because I think that it's public knowledge. We're really interested in partnering with others on the Shattuck development to address certain of our patients' needs. But what we have found is actually there is a subset of patients that are extremely medically complex that right now there really is no preference for them to be able to get access to affordable housing. Oftentimes they're too sick to stay in shelters, and so therefore they're not able to be on the city's radar and to get the city's priority around what's called chronic homelessness. And so what ends up happening is we end up housing them. We end up housing them in our inpatient unit and in our emergency department at extremely high rates. And so what we end up with is issues, particularly under that Affordable Care Act, where we are at full risk. And so we want people to be successful, period. But it also is a better financial product for us to be able to get someone stably housed so that they can be healthier. So you're right. 30 units is in some ways a drop in the larger bucket of what we're trying to solve for. But for us, it's one tool in a larger portfolio approach for us to be able to stably house people. Did that answer your question, Yvette, or would you like me to elucidate more?
It gets to it. And I'm thinking about, 130 units, and 30 of them are going to serve this need, and 100 of them are going to be serving the needs of people who have the wherewithal to pay market rates. And it doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't compute for me very well. I get what you're trying to do, but like, there's more than 30 people who have the need.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would agree with what Megan said. It really is a portfolio approach. And we also don't think that the one type of housing necessarily fits every patient type, right, that we have, right? And so that's why we do believe that the Shattuck is potentially a very important kind of piece of the puzzle that we want to be involved in. We've had discussions with the state, and Desi's aware of that as well. And, we've been having discussions with Pine Street Inn about how we can better collaborate with them to help. And it's also part of the reason of why it's important to us that we have a real estate developer as a partner on this project, because the need is so great, and we can't become a housing developer as an organization. And so, making sure that we could take this whole property and say we're going to propose to do 130 units of supportive housing just there. But I think we've also seen in the country that just taking one kind of subset of patients or people and trying to put them all in one location, as opposed to having the diversity of people living together, it's a better model to have the diversity as opposed to these kind of islands of different types of problems, if you will. And so, we think this is going to be a longer term strategy that we're going to have to solve in many different locations, and some of them outside of the city of Boston, perhaps, right? It's not necessarily all going to be in our neighborhood or on the Shattuck campus or even in the city of Boston. And it's part of the reason, the research that we see is different than what most other academic medical centers in Boston are doing, right? Where they're doing benchtop research. We see an opportunity to really study these new models of care and providing housing and how it's helping different types of patients, so that we can continue to evolve and improve upon it. And to do that, you have to try kind of pilot test projects of different types of settings and so forth. And so it's a work in progress that is going to take time, and the need is probably on the scale of thousands, not tens or even hundreds.
Yeah.
Bob, before you take the next question, can you please take your slides down just so it's easier to see
Sure.
whoever's speaking? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Christy. All right, so Andy, I think, is next, then Fernando, and then I see Pamela, and then I see Karen.
All right, well, for one, thank you for the presentation, and I appreciate even though I don't live near Building H, I appreciate the fact that you took the input into account. That's great. I have two questions, one for Bob and one for Megan. For Bob, you mentioned that there won't be any additional parking built, but so how many additional people, because they're going to have to get in and out, and they're going to have cars, some of them will, and if you don't provide parking, it's going to come from somewhere else. It's going to put a bunch of traffic. So how many additional, there'll certainly be 100 additional families from the 100 affordable units, but how many additional employees do you anticipate?
I don't have the number of employees off the top of my head. What I will tell you is that the vast majority of our employees take public transportation. We have a much higher percentage than any other hospital in Boston. And the other thing I will tell you is that we continue the work from home, that I mentioned earlier. We continue to both move certain subsets of employees off campus. We have some of our finance department are now down in Quincy. We opened a mail order pharmacy in Randolph. And so, we're continuing to migrate kind of back office functions off of the campus to reduce the needs for parking as well. During the course of this IMP, as I mentioned, we're going to be vacating both the Gambro building and exiting that parking. And we're going to be vacating the doctor's office building. Significant number of those employees that are in those some will relocate, within the area. We're working on a potential lease right now. But it will be at least, I would say, 40% less square footage. The rest of them will go to a work from home model, so that we can reduce the parking needs. And, the other thing is that we have a much higher percentage of patients that use public transportation than any other hospital. And so we just don't see parking as a need right now. We have not run out of parking.
Okay, fair enough. And then the next question is for Megan. So I love the idea of supportive housing. I like that, the specific goals that you have make a lot of sense. Put people that need to frequently access medical treatment, and it's hard for them to move to be right near the hospital. Maybe they won't even have to go outside. That all is great. I guess the one concern that I have, and I'll bet I'm not the only one on this call, is that we do live in an area that is plagued by opiate use disorder. And I guess my concern is that if how many of those patients, although it's not you went out of your way to say it's not a sober home and it's not a treatment center, but how many of those medical needs are opiate use disorder? Because the fear is that you're just going to be putting them in a place where it's going to be extra hard for them to stay sober. And so is that, that's, I guess, my concern, and
Yeah.
maybe other people have that same concern.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really fair question, right? I think that in a lot of ways, given the concentration of certain services in the South End, I would understand that concern a lot. I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is the people that we would move into these units would be very heavily engaged in what's called our complex care management program. And part of that engagement within complex care management is that they would be further along in their recovery. And so within that, many of them would be, engaged with medically assisted treatment and other things. I realize this question of like the milieu, right? Like you're putting them in a situation that would potentially jeopardize the recovery. But I think our goal is to give people the opportunity to continue to be stable. And so we do think that this is something that we feel confident we can put the right wraparound services. And in some ways, there's like two triage processes, right? Like the first triage process is that you engage in care and case management. Not everyone does that. And then after you've engaged in care, then we see whether you're a good fit for this housing. And then we triage you and into the housing itself. The other piece to keep in mind is anyone who's eligible for affordable housing gets vetted pretty heavily in terms of criminal background checks and other things. And so that this is in some ways a pipeline that I think hopefully would be a very stable long-term supportive housing population.
Well,
does that answer your question, Andy?
Not quite. So
Okay.
how would you, well, I'll ask it differently. There's
Okay.
what, I could be doing great if I'm not near a whole bunch of drug dealers. And if, now you put me near those drug dealers and it's just enough for me to go over the edge. So, I guess what you said makes sense, but then there's this whole housing first thing, which says we don't care about any of that. And so you can comment, I'm concerned that if you're not careful with this, you could not only jeopardize the other patients, like the two examples you gave in the slideshow, they would be great if people, those, if it was going to be 30 of those types of people, would be all great. But how does this compare to like all this housing first initiative?
No, thank you. So it's kind of funny. So I actually, I meant to put on the it is not housing first. This is a heavily, in some ways, vetted group. And so to an extent, part of the reason why I asked patients if it was okay to share their story is to try to say that is exactly who we plan to have in these units, is people like that. Now, I want to be clear, people are complex. And so sometimes they do have history of substance use disorder, and we embrace that. Like, I think that's part of their medical complexity. But again, this is not a housing first program. It really is not. It's really a heavily supportive housing program. And by it being so close to us, we'll be able to monitor the situation pretty extensively to ensure that people are successful at all levels. Does that help a little bit more?
Andy, I
would pass it. I'll pass them.
I would just like to add to that, Andy. I'm not a clinician, but I unfortunately have had personal experience within my own close family with this issue, and I don't think there's any good location to cite this type of stuff. I mean, whether it, at the time I was in Reading when I went through my experience, I can tell you Cape Cod, it doesn't matter where you are. The drug dealers are there, they're available, they're readily, and what's important for someone in recovery is to learn how to function and deal with those temptations and stay away from them, right? It's because unfortunately, it is readily available to anybody, anywhere, at any time. I don't know if that helps to address.
My turn.
Well, I'll let someone else go. I think it's clarified as much as it's going as it can be.
Can I speak now? Fernando.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think your proposal is a lot clearer than it was the first time. That really riled me up a little bit because I could not understand what you guys were after. It appears to me a lot more reasonable, and the idea of having a mixed use in the buildings, I think it's a great idea. I think it's something that would be an asset to the neighborhood. And in addition to that, the idea that you would have, a market rate component, I think it's a good idea too. And I think you need that income to be able to make this work. And I think that's very good. And in general, I think this keeps me much more at peace in regards to the possibilities of having problems again in that side of our neighborhood. I mean, we have enough problems on the other side of Massachusetts Avenue where Andy lives. Then I live in the other end, which is precisely a block away from the buildings you're talking about. So I think if you live to what you're telling me or telling us, I think that's something that probably could work. And that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. I'm really glad that the second time around, I will personally say I did a better job of explaining it. So thank you very much. Pamela.
Oh, well, Megan and Bob, thank you very much for your presentation. I guess I'm looking at the profiles of the two residents that you presented. I was wondering about the size of the units. You know, how many bedrooms, how you said 130 units, but is that 100 people? Is that 400 people? That there's that area, that question I have of density, because one of your cameos was a family.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering about the size of the units, and I assume that they'll all be, the units will be ADA accessible.
Yeah, so Pamela, we really haven't got into that detail yet. We would be doing that during the Article 80 process. I would imagine there'll be, a mixture of different size units, because we do envision that some of these would be for families, as you saw with one of our patients. I think some of them will be quite small and maybe more of studio level apartments, right? For folks that are single and to keep them affordable. So I think there'll be a mix of different sizes. I would also rely heavily on whoever our development partner was to help with those sizing of the different units, because they're going to understand this market better than we do, especially when you get into the market rate units. But given the location, I would think there'd probably end up being a fair number of smaller size units. I would think they would be attractive to grad students for BU and so forth as well. So, but when we go through the Article 80 process, we would go through this entire community process again with a lot more detail around the detailed design of the exterior and interior of the building.
Well, thank you, because I know at least, on Worcester Square, we had, buildings that, people used to live in, and there was 1 car per building, and then they went to condos and there were 10 cars per building. So
yeah,
size matters.
Yep, absolutely.
I think Karen was first, and then Helene, and then we'll come back to Yvette.
Hi. Hi. Let's see. I was wondering, I don't know if this is a relevant question, but are the patients going to be living there for the remainder of their lives? What size are the units going to be? You addressed that. Is this for families and singles? You've addressed it. Let's see. are you going to discuss additional buses on the MBTA? I know employees and staff access the hospital shuttle, but as an MBTA rider, I wonder if, you did mention, I know some of the patients may ride the MBTA, perhaps, and you did mention that the employees, a lot of them ride the MBTA. So perhaps you could, over time, discuss with them increasing the number of buses for those who are using these. But I was wondering about the sizes, how many, whether you're expecting families in the, not in the market rate ones, but in the 30. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think Bob said it really well. We haven't engaged in the design process. I do think most likely there probably will be mostly 1 and 2 bedrooms, maybe some 3 bedrooms, but I please, like, that is very much the Megan Sandel guesstimate. We haven't made any decisions yet. I do think that we would want to make sure that they are using what sometimes is called universal design to make sure that they're accessible. Many of our patients need help with either elevator buildings or accessible units. So I do think we would probably work with the developer around those costs to make sure that they're universally accessible. And to your question, Karen, around whether people would stay, honestly, to us, it's about choice. If someone comes and they're happy and they're doing well, then yeah, they could stay. If they decide they want to move somewhere else, then they would move out of that unit, and then we would probably partner with the developer to have another medically complex person move into the unit. But to us, it's not transitional. People would have the choice around what they wanted, and so we would want to make sure that they could age in place if that was their desire. Does that, and the MBTA bus question, I have to turn to Bob. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
Karen, what I might mention about the MBTA bus question, we will and do have conversations with the MBTA routinely, but you may or may not be aware of the Newmarket Business Improvement District, or BID, and we just signed on to that. And as part of that Business Improvement District, there'll be a new kind of shuttle program that will be created to the benefit of BMC, BU, as well as all the businesses in Newmarket, that will provide new connectivity for those businesses and their employees to the different MBTA stops in the area, the Red Line, the Fairline stop, and so forth. And so, I think that will be coming shortly. I actually have a proposal in my email inbox when I get back from vacation to review. So I think that will provide a significantly more connectivity for both employees and patients, I believe.
Okay. Thank you very much. While Andy Brand may think so I'm with him. Mm-hmm. And I think we're actually fairly close.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Different opinion. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Karen. Helene, I think if I'm not saying your name right, please correct me.
You're saying it correctly, thank you. The question I have, has this been done elsewhere? Because I question whether some of the good market rate people will want to live there. So has this been done elsewhere? And another question after that. My second question is, what services will you have in the building? What services will you have in the building that are supportive? Why can't this be done elsewhere? There's a lot of vacant property in the city that you could get the city to give over to you or something. And why can't you put these patients of yours who are in need of such things, build something there.
So it was hard to hear you, Helene, but let me take a stab and then Megan can add. You know, I really believe that when, if or when we get this built, I don't think it's going to feel any different than any other apartment building in the area. You know, we all have neighbors that are medically complex. My neighbor across the street has had, you know, home care for the last 4 years and just passed away last month. The difference here is that he could afford that. He had a roof over his head. He could afford that care. What we're talking about here is, you know, folks who have medical complexities and people who, anyone who has experience trying to navigate the healthcare system. It's unfortunately not as easy as we would like it all to be. And, you know, if they're medically complex and they have substance abuse issues potentially as a co-occurring problem, trying to get them to navigate that and stay healthy is challenging if they don't have a roof over their head to begin with. And that's what we saw in COVID. And so what this model does is begin to shelter these folks and provide them some navigation, if you will, to help them navigate our complex healthcare system to improve their health so that they can, but I don't think they're much different than any of the neighbors we all have already. I really don't.
I understand that, but why can't you do this elsewhere in the city? Has anyone done it anywhere that you know of?
So, so Helene, to that point, we have been doing it in other parts of the city. We've been partnering with other housing developers and starting to do this, what we would call like embedded housing with supports alongside other units. And it's actually been really successful. To answer your question around the services, we are using a model that has been studied before called Supports and Services at Home, or SASH. SASH. And it basically is that you have an on-site like community health worker, not somebody with a ton of medical expertise, but somebody that can like check in on you, make sure that if you're needing help getting to appointments or other types of things, that's the type of person that's having kind of a regular touch point with you. And then perhaps some access to, say, a nurse if you need a little bit of care facilitation, because it is true to Bob's point, our healthcare system isn't always the easiest to navigate. And so we have found that kind of combination of kind of a community health worker, a little bit of nursing can be really successful in helping to avert people getting into a medical crisis that results in them having to go to the ER. Or if they do come into the hospital, it helps transition them back to their house so that they don't have to go into a nursing home or other things. And so I do think this is a model that has been done other places. It is something we're already doing in other parts of Boston. And then to an extent, to Yvette's point, we're doing it on our campus in this way, but we're also trying to do it in other parts of the city. We're already partnering with Boston Housing Authority because the need is big. And so it is a both and approach. And we think that this is, we really think success is going to be, you're going to walk by this building and you're going to have no idea that there's a Housing for Health program embedded in it. That's our definition of success.
So
Well, speaking of
the other thing I would just add is, so BMC did about 2 years ago, BMC tested the waters to see about potentially just selling these two buildings. And when we went through that process, we talked to several different interested parties, and each of them came back and ultimately felt that the building's the highest and best use was housing, which housing isn't allowed use on that site. And they're not really good for office space. Again, they're not good for medical. And so we felt that this proposal, and I would say when we went through the IMP prior to COVID, we heard from the neighbors that people would like to see housing. And so we thought that this proposal was kind of a win-win-win, right? Where it adds housing, which is desperately needed, provides some affordable housing. It aligns with BMC's mission, and we believe it's going to significantly benefit some of our patients. And it gives us the opportunity to derive some financial value from it that will also allow us to then further along this journey of trying to, ideally use that money to do something with an investment over at the Shattuck campus. You know, because that is going to be an expensive proposition that's not going to pay for itself.
But who are the neighbors that you talked to? You said you talked to some neighbors and they wanted housing?
I heard that as comments in some of the community meetings we did before COVID. I don't recall who made the comment, but I know I heard some comments that people would have liked to have seen housing.
Or just so I can follow up on, have you, there's other places that you're involved with, were they like this, a marketplace residences and then a small percentage of affordable housing?
Yeah, so a lot of times in the way that you do that is you take a market rate apartment and you layer in an affordable housing voucher. And so by putting those vouchers tied to a unit, sometimes it's called project basing the voucher. That's one way that this has been done in other parts of the country. And it's also one way that we've done it here in Boston.
All right, my concern is your involvement with BHA. We've had BHA on our street and Pine Street Inn building, and it's been a disaster. One person was dealing drugs, the other person was an alcoholic and bringing prostitutes in during COVID, and the first was evicted. I don't know, the second is supposed to be evicted. I don't know whether he's gotten out yet. But so will BHA be involved in this?
So we're planning to work with a private developer. I will say to Bob's point, part of why we want to stay as a minority interest is because it will help us ensure that this is done well, right? Like, and so that's really important that we're staying engaged. But on the other hand, we're a hospital. We're not an owner or an operator of housing. And so we want to partner well with someone who provides the vouchers for the units. We're so early in the stages. Helene, I can't answer whether BHA would provide them or someone else. So we're not sure.
You got to watch out for BHA is all I'm saying.
Okay.
Put these two people in, there was a disaster. The other people in the building who were perfectly fine. And the BHA was terrible.
Okay. Well, thank you. I see Yvette's hand up and I want to answer another question for her. I also want to give other people a chance who haven't already spoken.
Yeah, could I speak for a second?
Yeah,
before
please.
Yvette? Yeah.
Is that okay, Yvette? Sorry.
And Steve
Okay.
Fox, I think, also messaged that he had a comment too.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a couple of things to say. One, it seems to be 130 units is overly ambitious. I mean, you're looking at 100,000 square feet. You're losing the first two floors. You're down to about 83 or 84,000 feet. And then my impression is you always lose 20% to elevators, to staircases, to hallways. So now we're looking at 65,000 square feet for 130 units, which would be about 500 square feet each, which would make all of them small, really. I mean, it seems to me if you get down to more like 100, then you're talking about market rate and sort of the same people, not just graduate students, but some, people who would live in this neighborhood otherwise, right? I think would maintain the composition of the neighborhood better. The second thing is what I'm hearing you say, and I just want confirmation, is for the 30 units, you are looking for medically complex people. Some of those inevitably will be people who are struggling or have struggled with addiction, but you're not actually looking for, you're not primarily saying we're going to get people, we're looking for people who have a history of addiction. You're looking for medically complex, and inevitably some of them will have that. So is that?
Yeah, that's a fair characterization. I mean, I think for us, part of our when you look at who is super medically complex and costly to our system, it's people with chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes and kidney disease. Kidney disease is really expensive. So you're absolutely right. We are targeting people who have medical complexity because that is sort of a win-win for us. If we make them healthier, that's good for them, and it potentially is good for our health system. But you're right, George, we are being transparent that many of those people do have a history of a substance use disorder that they're being treated for.
Okay, very good. I think Yvette, let's do Yvette, and if that's it, then let's I mean, you don't actually need anything from us. You're not looking for a letter of support or anything. This is really about presenting and, you know, and
transparent. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Yvette, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is perhaps pretty simple, but I do want to express that I actually feel like the concept is very good. And I appreciate that concept that housing matters. And so that's the starting place. But here's my challenge. I live across the street from the Stoughton service entrance, what I would call the service entrance, where the trucks go in and out, sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning with their beep, beep, beep going on. It's busy, and I'm trying to understand, where's the access going to be to this set of apartments? Like, is it where I'm looking at when I look out my window, or is it around the corner? I don't really understand. I saw the map quickly, but I really couldn't orient myself. So if you could just help me with that.
Yeah, so again, I'm gonna say that we haven't designed it yet. So we would go through that in detail when we do the Article 80 process. I would say that right now, we believe it will probably end up, if you go onto East Newton Street, there is the old entrance to the Old Evans building that is no longer used right now. And, you know, we believe we would be reactivating that entrance because that's where the elevators are currently and we create a new kind of residential lobby in that location for accessing the upper floors.
So if I go from Harrison and I make a right on East Newton, toward Albany.
Yep.
I'm going to come to an area where there's all sorts of scaffolding, etc., and a set of stairs going up to, it looks like a plaza on the inside of the.
Yeah, well before that.
Side of the building. Well before that. Okay.
Yeah, well, before you get to the bridge that's going over the building. Over the road, right? That road, that bridge. Yep. It's probably just before that on the right. There's an archway.
Okay.
Side of the building that used to be the lobby entrance.
Okay.
And so we believe we'll reopen that as the new entrance for the residential, but that could change when we get into design, and we'd go through that in a lot more detail in the Article 80 process once we get design, but we think that's where it will be.
So the building that's across the street, pretty much across the street from me, that's got the big copper green decorative whatever, is the other side of that entrance, basically, of that building.
Yeah, so I think the one with the copper that you're talking about is the Robinson building. Might be easier to go back to that slide if we could.
Yeah, do you want me, let me pull it up. Hold on a second.
That Robinson building is actually BU's building, and that we're not changing. So if you look at this.
Okay. Yep.
BU, so that building is office space, it's BU's, which has nothing to do with anything we're doing. It's not our.
Yeah. So
it's the stretch of building that is along East Newton Street and just wraps the corner a little bit onto Harrison Avenue. And then the entrance is it's actually, if you look where the O is on Old, that's where the elevators and the entrance is straight there, with the W on Newton, right?
Okay.
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Fernando?
Steve Fox, are you still here?
Yeah, just a quickie, just so everyone's aware. I think it's been referenced a number of times, but this process that we're going through in terms of the IMP is just really the first stage. I think Bob's first slide said something about the fact that we've got a ZBA hearing process, we've got a an Article 80 process to go through. So the fact is what we're talking about tonight is really a conceptual model as opposed to any kind of fine detail in terms of what it's going to look like in the end. And we'll all have a chance to take a look at that and be able to react to it in both the ZBA as well as the Article 80 process. So I'm really wanted to thank both Bob and Megan for their willingness to come to multiple meetings and to engage us in conversation. Appreciate, Megan, the refinement that we've done tonight in terms of the modeling. So I just wanted to say as a task force member, I really appreciate tonight and the conversation. So thanks again.
Thanks. Thanks for suggesting that we come, and thank you, George, for organizing the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like Fernando and Helene are the next two with their hands up. Fernando, you did.
Okay, yes. My question is about this 10-story building, really, the one that's going to be fronting, the Staunton Street entrance or whatever. Where is the entrance to that building going to be?
We think it will come through that ground floor of the old Evans building, but separate entrance, not through that same location that I just mentioned. But most of it, we actually think is going to, most of the traffic as it does today for the buildings that are there will come through BU, right? Our researchers, our physicians, they're all BU physicians as well, and BU faculty. And so we expect that it won't really need a prominent entrance, and that the connectivity into the BU campus will just provide for that natural flow of researchers and physicians and faculty through the campus.
As a follow-up to that, what do you plan to do with that entrance of Stoughton Street? Are you going to improve it? It's a sore, and it's like a tooth missing on Harrison Avenue, especially for people that live nearby, like Yvette.
So we do not own that entrance. That's owned by Boston University. We have easement rights to use it for access to this building. But we don't own it. So, whatever we do there, we would do collaboratively with BU, and I'd have to work with them on it. So I couldn't.
Okay, thank you.
Helene? Helene, if you're speaking, please unmute yourself.
I did, okay. You made the statement that you all wouldn't be long-term holders. I don't understand what that means. That means you would be, I don't understand what that means. I think Megan said that.
I may have been confusing. I think what I meant is that we would work with a developer, and we would be a minority owner with the developer. But it's on our campus. We would obviously have a permanent stake in making it successful, if that helps answer the question.
Yes, and then another question I had. Bob, you're a senior vice president. Are there any junior vice presidents?
They're not junior. There's vice presidents, and then there's senior vice presidents. I don't know that there's that much of a difference between us, though.
Well, all right. And
maybe it's just the gray hair that got me the senior. I don't know.
Okay. I think that's all I had. Is a hotel in Crosstown still in that? Is a hotel still in that building?
In Crosstown, yes, it is, I believe. Yep.
So that will continue there.
Yes, that's a separate ownership. We own the building next. They're physically attached, but they're two different ownership structures. We own the office building, outpatient building, and they own as a different owner of the hotel.
What about that convenience store that used to be on the corner?
BMC owns that, and we plan on. You're talking about You're talking about the old Cumberland Farms, correct?
That's right. Is
Yeah,
that still closed?
we own that, and we, you know, we're planning to renovate that space for a BMC use, not a convenience store again.
Okay. All right,
I
thank you.
think,
Thanks, Helene. So I think I'm gonna jump in, and this is more of a comment. So if I think about what the IMP task force members, so that's myself, Fernando, and Steve are tasked with, I guess we're tasked with providing input on approving the change in use from, I'll just call it like hospital space to mixed use, which would be housing and some sort of retail. So based on what I'm hearing in this meeting, it sounds like there are some details that people might be concerned about, whether it's parking, maybe the square footage of units, entrances, but in terms of like the bigger picture of BMC requesting a change in use from this building, I'm not hearing major opposition or really any serious opposition. So because of that, I would be inclined to support this. But if I am mischaracterizing the people who spoke tonight, please speak up just so that I'm accurately reflecting the neighborhood at the next meeting. Looks like Jim Clarkson has his hand up.
Yeah, wasn't sure if I wanted to ask these questions, but thought I just might have. Don't really know a lot about these sorts of public-private partnerships. I was wondering, is the developer going to end up purchasing any of the real estate from you? And would you expect any kind of revenue sharing result from this?
So yes, I expect the developer would purchase an ownership interest in the space. You know, and they, you know, we haven't selected a developer yet, but ones that I've talked to, they would want that ownership interest. Ones I've talked to would want to own the ground as well, so that they, you know, have a longer term control. We do think that if, you know, we stay a minority owner, you know, there would be some revenue coming back to us, although, you know, we're going to be mostly focused on the lower income kind of support units, right? So we think it's mostly going to benefit those patients. That's kind of the financial return for BMC, if you will. It's less, you know, we don't expect a significant rental revenue stream from it. You know, and I would say that it, you know, I don't know what the future holds, whether this ends up being the right model for the long term. And, you know, it's conceivable that at some point in the future, BMC could choose not to be an owner and would sell its share out, which is why it's extremely important that it be approved through the ZBA, not through the IMP process, because that zoning has to be available for whoever would own this in the future, even if it isn't BMC. Otherwise, it would make no sense to make such a very large investment into the site. So hopefully that answers your question.
Sure, thanks.
Okay.
Bob and George, one other thing I should have mentioned, I know this got said a few times, but if the IMP task force votes yes, BMC then proceeds, they get a partner, they then have to go through a zoning process where there's significant community input. So when I refer to some of the concerns as details, what I should have said is that there will be an opportunity to ask the more detailed questions in the future. But in terms of like big picture, it seems like no one is majorly opposed, and it seems like most people are generally supportive of housing. So thank you.
Right.
Yeah, Desi, that's correct. And you know, this is an important process for us, because clearly if there was a lot of opposition to this, it would be kind of a waste of our time to try to go to ZBA next. You know, we want, you know, people to be supportive of this and feel that it's good for the neighborhood. And, you know, and we do believe long-term it's part of it's a small part of the picture of what's going to need to be done to alleviate a lot of the problems we see along the you know, Mass Ave and Milena Katz, right? But it's one small piece of that, but it's going to require a lot more effort. And so that, you know, having this, the community be somewhat supportive of this is important to us as we move on into the next part of the process, I guess, if you will. And I think the BPDA feels that way as well.
Well, all I can say is, Helene again, is I'm ambivalent about it. So, you know, I just have a, I don't know. I'm ambivalent.
Okay, let's, Bob,
George, I'm sorry. On the last slide that we had down at the bottom in the footnotes, there's links that you can click on that give you more detail of the videos that will provide you more detail of the stories of those patients that I think are really compelling. I would encourage each of you to click on those links and watch those videos. It really transformed those patients' lives.
okay, very good. Very good. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Megan. I'll see you all next month. Sounds like it was an excellent meeting. Yeah, I think minds were changed, and that's great. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.